Thank you, and thank you for stealing my openings line, where I was going to say, welcome to statistically the best session of Igloo conference on testing. Anyway, I'm Sam. I flew in from Belgium, happily, of course. I think this is my third IglooConf, maybe my fourth, and I'm also Microsoft Azure MVP. I've been actually building my career in a company called Codit, where I was CTO and co-founder. So there I learned all the things with backend and integration and so on. But then we got acquired by a company in Belgium, and after that, let's say 3 years later, I left the company because I wanted to do, instead of working for a large enterprise company, I wanted to do things, getting my hands dirty, going back to building stuff, and that's where I said, okay, I want to work with startups. So I have my own startup, which is called Sphinx. We do physical access management, so opening smart locks of all different kinds in a way that you can control who is entering your house and when. And next to that, I also have a passion for cycling and traveling. Now, that last passion, maybe the last but one, but the cycling is the thing that I will use to explain the testing approaches that I do. Because next to my job, what I've been doing in the past 5 years, I think, is also building an application that is called Kotacol. It's quite Belgian, because it's actually based on a historical encyclopedia that was built in the 80s by people making a list of 1,000 different hills that you could ride with a bike. With their profiles, they give it a score and things like that. So it's quite impressive, especially because I don't think there was Excel back in those days. So they were really mathematicians and people riding bikes. So they were doing all these things by hand, making those drawings. What we did with 3 people was making sure, okay, let's make a digital version of that. So there's an app, there's a website, and there's integration. So what we say is that if people go cycling and they register on our platform, if they use Strava, who knows Strava? Okay, most people, so it's a sports platform. So if you use that, you actually give us permissions to read your activities, and we will detect if you have conquered one of these 1,000 different hills in Belgium. That's what we do. There's a score, like how much calls did you cover and things like that. So we have an app. That's the thing that I have not built. But the things on the right I did. So everything with integration with Strava, and that's really backend oriented, I did. And I also built a website. As I said, my background really is in backend and integration. So probably my code is looking better than the website, but still I tried to broaden things up. And actually, Blazor has been quite helpful for me because I don't know anything about JavaScript, but still I was able to build some kind of website that I still like. For this, I have been doing setting up tests. And why do we test, of course? Yeah, because we love it? Probably not. Because we always get enough budget and time for it? No, I don't think anyone said that. But at the same time, I think we all realize that we get benefits and advantages from doing that. Of course, bug detection, having consistency and reliability, and a peace of mind. If you can say, I released this new feature, and you have an automated way of doing the stuff that you always hate and that you always want to skip, the manual testing, you have much better confidence in deploying stuff. So I think it's quite key. And it also helps sometimes in documentation, in my opinion. So I have been applying a lot of different things in practice for that startup, but I will use the community platform, so the Kotacol, in most of the demos. The session today is totally not about theoretical things. If you're a real, pure test theoretical person, you will know much more things than I do. The thing I want to share is how I'm now a person responsible for virtually anything that is on the technical side, because the startup has 2 people. One is doing more sales, commercial things and investment, and I'm doing the development, the testing, the DevOps, whatever you have, so getting the hands dirty. So it's a very pragmatic approach. This is not a one size that fits all, but I will focus on the 4 different things here. So unit tests, we will talk about integration tests, which in my opinion in platforms like this are the most important. I'll show you how you can do load tests with Microsoft Azure, and of course some UI tests, because even though my UI is not looking sexy, it should still work, and that's the whole intention. Maybe first a short demo on what the product would be. So I have here a test account on Strava, where I will just upload a GPX, so that's a ride that you would do with your bike, right? And that happens typically with your watch or your mobile phone or whatever you're doing, and you can see here, there's a ride, and I will give it a name, Igloo demo, and I will make sure it's a private one that no one else is seeing it, because it's a fake ride. I wish I was riding it, but I was here in Finland preparing my session. So this has now been uploaded on Strava, and actually behind the scenes, they are calling a webhook, because I gave Kotakol the authorization to listen to this, and we are processing that. So we are processing the activity, and if all goes well, you can see here the description is empty. If I do an F5 here, and this can take a while because Strava is sometimes, taking a few minutes to get, the webhook called, and we have service bus behind the scenes. So you should see at least that there is an activity updated, and that you will see the calls that I have done. This is the application here. So the web app, as you can see, we have 8,000 people registered. So it's quite nice because of people seeing someone did a ride on Strava. They can see, oh, he conquered that list. So he has 5 different new climbs conquered. Oh, and there's the URL. So they go and look, because people want to collect things, right? This is not about being the fastest. This is about collecting as much as you can. And actually, zooming out here, let's go to the statistics. There are a few people that have been doing, we're crunching the numbers, and internet connection is not ideal, but there's a few people that have conquered all the 1,000 of these quota calls. So there's, I think, around 8 of them that have done it, and that's quite impressive if you ask me. Let's see if we can get the details here. I know, it will take some time. That's always the thing that happens when you give a live demo, that the webhooks and so on will always be a little bit later, but never mind. The unit tests is the thing that I think everyone is familiar with, and that you can quite easily write, and it's also something that is not taking a lot of time. They typically help with code correctness, also detecting the bugs quite easily, and also with refactoring. Refactoring is a part of your job quite often if you're a software developer, and doing that can result in some side effects. The more of these tests you have, the better, of course, that you're confident. What I always do and recommend is, if you have an issue, a bug, that you first write the test that fails, and that you make sure that the test becomes green. And what I also see quite often, if you build like libraries that people can use, or you have a framework and an open source thing, is that tests can quite often help in documentation to understand how you should use that application. Just by writing and using the tests, you expose the behavior that you expect to have. So you typically focus on the smallest piece of components. And while I'm totally not one of the people that would say, oh, you have to have a code coverage of X% with all the unit tests, I would say focus on the tests where it makes sense. And in my opinion, it's really on the helper classes and the libraries where you can have a lot of isolated parts that have to be tested. So common methods that I would test, for example, is in my front end, I think I have to do somewhere the print of a number. Like if it's the length of the climb has to be, and I get it in 1,500 meters, I would write it in 1.500 m, for example. So that's like, but it could be null, so I have to make sure that if it's below 0, then I put a line and things like that. So that's a very easy type of method to write, because you have a lot of behavior inside that method that you want to test. And then, of course, the thing that you quite often have, I assume most of you are familiar with the dependency injection that you typically use when doing API development and so on, where you have services that you inject. Sometimes these services are used to contact a repository, for example, a data registry, things like that, or you have external services. For unit tests, often you want to mock them away, so meaning that you don't integrate with the external services. For that, you have mocking. So mocking is something that you can do. Here I have used the mock queue, so the mock library, where I have an interface, iTranslator service, and I say, for my test, instead of using my translator service that actually uses resource files that I would have to include in my tests, I say, I create a new mocking object of iTranslator service, and what I do, because in my test, the only thing I will do is making the get to return something. There I say, okay, if that method is being called, just return the initial value. That's, it's mocking up one thing instead of implementing a full test class in memory, for example, which is the thing that I did in the past. So, and there then I do my test just saying printed distance is equal that, and then I do my assertions. So that's typically unit testing, and that's also the smallest part of today, the thing that I think is most commonly known, and the thing where I will spend most of the time with is with the integration tests. So in my opinion, in a system, because looking back at Kotakol, but actually in most of the startups I'm involved with, you have backend logic. Think about messaging, things like service bus in Azure, things like databases. You have APIs, data that comes in. In the case of Kotakol, I'm having so the Strava webhook integration. I'm using key vaults because I have the tokens of my users, the refresh tokens and so on, to contact their information or to receive their information on the Strava API. These things are in key vault, right? The data is in the database of SQL Azure. So there's quite a lot of different dependencies that, that are being used. So unit testing is never enough, but of course, integration testing alone is also never enough. So you have to combine the things, again, where they are quite relevant. So the right one has the integration test working, but I think the unit test should be read in that one. So what's an integration test? And it's quite similar to system tests and so on. You have tests that you group functionally, and in the things that I have been testing so far, I mostly test against the API, because both for the application as the integration points, most of the things have been exposed through an API, so I typically don't include the front end as the web application or the app itself here. I test against my API, and that's quite important. So the next slides will go a little bit deeper in how to test ASP.NET APIs, both locally as in the cloud. For these things, I also use the real databases for integration tests. So a database or an external system, I would typically use it where it's relevant. And then the thing that ideally, because I'm the tester and I'm the developer, and that's never ideal, but budget is a reality in a startup. What is there that you have a separate team of testers, and they typically don't have to know and understand the implementation of the system. So the only thing that they have to do is write tests in a language they understand, and that they can do the, that you can do the mapping to the implementations. And that's what we call black box testing. That's a theory. That's something that, to be honest, I have not seen too much. But it depends on how far you go. Typically, the higher the enterprise, the more it happens probably. So let's focus now on the API testing itself. So as I said, if you test your API, I think that is the key to start your integration tests. One thing that I use is NSWAG, and there's other tools for that, but I don't know if people know NSWAG. So if you have ASP.NET API, you can just install the NSWAG NuGet packages They have a build package itself as well. And they allow you to automatically generate a client, a strong typed client, against your API. They also help you to generate the OpenAPI spec, so the JSON, and you can also tune these things, or the YAML, sorry, as files, which I also do to include them in my build and deployment pipeline. So we are using Azure API management, and in our repository, you will see the OpenAPI specs of our different APIs as artifacts. And I'm importing them at deploy time in Azure API management. So that's, if you've seen the session of Henry about Bicep, I'm having a Bicep module that gets the URL in my repository to that open API, and I'm just importing that in API management. So the good thing is that NSWAG is helping me to do all of that, and it also helps in strong typing my API tests, because actually I'm having a client and I'm using that client to test against my API. That also means if my client would suddenly break because I have done a change of my API itself and the client has been regenerated and suddenly my client code breaks, in fact I know that I have a breaking change in my API and I should think about versioning, because if I have the breaking change in my strong typed client, probably the real consumers may have a similar thing. So let's go a little bit to a demo on how you typically set it up. So I assume most of you know how ASP.NET applications work, or APIs work. So what you can see here is in my project, and I will zoom in as soon as we get there, I have I just have a post-build event where the only thing I'm doing is I'm saying you have to generate this OpenAPI spec file. And by the way, you have to use the nswag client.json to generate that client API. And that is here. And what you can see here is that it will output to that specific file, so a CS file. It will output that, that client. So that is existing here in a different project, Web API client with just one file. I will just do a delete. And you will now see that I should, I will, as you can see, probably on the bottom, I have 32 errors, so you know that I have exceptions now, because of course my file is gone. So if I now build my API, of course it could take a while, because now it's generating that JSON file, the OpenAPI spec for my deployment time, but it should also build if things go well. What's that sound? It's the... So as you can see now, by doing a real rebuild, there is automatically all the code generated. And you should see, for example, we have badges. So to collect stuff, you should see a badge API client, I guess, like you have an interface and so on. So against that interface, I will be able to do get badge async. I will be able to do get badge for a specific, all the list of badges and so on, right? So that's the nice thing that I use nswag for. And the next thing that I do then is I test locally. So it's what is important. Of course, and that's the last slide of the session later, I do it in the CI/CD pipelines as well, so in my DevOps flow. But locally, when you do most of your development, before I make my pull request, or even for some functionality that I want to test, I just run my tests locally. And for that, I use my own local database, so I have the real database. I'm not mocking away these things. I use a local Docker image here, so it's running at this moment. But at another customer or company, we use against the Azure database that is deployed in a development resource group. So it's up to you. It's just a matter of connection strings that you use. And for some specific things, you can still inject test, stub, mock services. For example, for key vault integration, that's one of the things that I sometimes avoid, and I have like an in-memory class or a mock. Service bus integration is also something that I say, okay, for locally, I just run it and I remove my messaging system. I replace my message service by something in memory, because I don't want to integrate with service bus. I just want to focus on some specific things. And I don't know if you're familiar with that specific package there, the ASP.NET Core MVC testing, but that's the one that allows me to run my API without having to do, to have the API really running as a project. So I don't have to do .NET run or F5 on my API project to test against it. What I do, I actually say, and that API is then hosted in the process of my tests, for example. And what I do, I create an application factory, API test application factory, that implements this specific abstract class. And I'm passing, and that's the important one, I'm passing the program.cs class. That may be ringing a bell, because that's the startup class from my API project. So I will go and show that. I think it's here. Yeah. So I have my application factory, and what I'm doing, I'm saying, okay, I'm creating the host. And by the way, this is the thing that I wanted to show. The program, as you can see, if I go here to my navigation, the program is in my actual web API project. I hope you can read enough, but that's the startup file where all the dependencies are being injected. For example, here, my iActivity log persistence service is this and ta-ta-ta-ta. So that's how the API is really starting up normally, but I'm also starting it up now in this web application factory. And what I do then specifically, I say I use everything that has been injected in the real service. The only thing that I change here, but you can change much more things, so I could override some specific services that I want to inject in my testing step. The only thing I do is, instead of using the SQL settings, so the configuration, the connection string, I'm using it from my own configuration object, and that's just locally. So I'm here saying I'm using the secrets, so the user secrets from my test application. And if you go here, I don't know if you're familiar with .NET user secrets, and don't take any pictures, but they are streaming this as well, right? Anyway, here we go. That's my connection string. You still have to be able to connect my database locally. But I'm using my local configurations of my tests, so I can test against a different database than I would run my application. But if I would specify something here, for example, services, I don't know what happens now. Let's be a little bit patient. So I hope you can understand that I could say services.add singleton, and I overwrite the same interface in a different way, things like that. I could replace things. That's what I could do here for my testing. So instead of using my real key vault integration that I use for my deployed API, I could say, here I inject my own stub service in this case. Let's try it a bit like this. So as I said, you could override stuff here. So in this, Lambda, whatever it's called, you could add your own stuff for in case you're testing locally. So inject specific services. The next thing I then do is I have to create an HTTP client, of course, because you use the HTTP client to test against an API or to call an API. That HTTP client is the one that I have to pass to my generated code from NSWAG, so the step before. And what I'm doing here, I use this web application test factory, so the previous class that I've shown, and I say, okay, let's create a client now against that factory. So that's a client that works in process. And what I'm doing here, I can specify the base address. So if it's locally, it should be the local host, just like that. But I'm using the same tests in my CI/CD pipeline, or even locally if I say, oh, I want to test against my test environment and so on. And then I'm overriding by putting in the API base URL. So it's just a configuration parameter. So if the parameter is provided, I will test against the deployed API. If it's not provided, I will test locally inside the same process. Okay, so that's how these things work. And then a regular test would look like this. So this is Xunit, where you would say, okay, it's like a unit test that you write from structure, but I would test against there. So I'm here, for example, I'm saying this should throw an API exception because I'm just calling a user that has a random number, so the user will not exist, and I would get a 404. So I could do more of those tests, but just get the ID. Now, let's see if we can go back to here. Because the next step starts to look better. The next step that I want to show is how SpecFlow is something that I use. Someone familiar with SpecFlow? Not too much. I have some doubts about it, to be honest, because it's been a while since they really updated and brought out new versions. But I still think it's quite relevant and interesting, and there's good tooling inside the tools. For example, the one that I'm using, Rider. So it's a testing framework for behavior-driven testing to write human-readable acceptance tests, and that's the difference. Eh? So you have descriptive tests where you say, okay, I'm doing an implementation of the steps as a developer. So they have to implement the steps, but the cases can be written by the testers. That's the idea. So what you have features. And let's see if I can. I think we're good again. You have features. These are the ones that you would functionally describe your test. So I will show that in the next one. And then the features will translate. So they have a set of steps. They will translate into the implementation of steps. And these are code classes. And then you have hooks. Hooks are typically events that you can use to do a preparation or a cleaning. Imagine that you have generated a lot of new data in your tests. You could say something like, after my test, I will remove my test data from my data source, things like that. And a driver is the one where you would hide implementation details to keep your steps clean. So these are these items. But this is the interesting part. This is how a test case looks like, in my opinion. So I say, my scenario is, if an existing user checks his Strava activities, this is how it gets implemented. So given our test user, when the user reads 10 latest activities, then the activities should be valid and the number of activities should be 10. So this is a step. This is something that you understand. This is something that a tester could understand. What is the case here? That translates to a step with this attribute that's SpecFlow specific, and this is just an implementation that I do. So here I can specify whatever I need. I can get the data from my database and things like that. Here I'm also specifying something with the attribute when, because it maps that. But you can now see there's some kind of regular expression where the 10 becomes a variable, and the 10 becomes the variable that is being passed. So that's how you can specify input parameters towards your testing steps. The next thing is then this should happen and then that should happen. So again, there you typically would in the then methods, you would do your assertions. There you would say, I'm expecting the length to be 10 and things like that. Okay? What you also have is context injection. This is like keeping state between the different steps. So if you go back here, giving our test user, there I would, in that context, save the user ID, because I would use it, that same user ID in the second step to call my API with that user ID. So that's how things work. I can show that quite soon. Let's skip the drivers. And this is, for example, how you can do the hooks. So here I have my before scenario. So before I run that step, I'm actually initializing my driver. Behind the scenes, I'm just making that HTTP client that I can use to call against the API that I use. So these are attributes that you have. Before and after, typically, scenario step, feature, and things like that. All right? Let's go to the demo. So sorry for this. I think Saka has similar issues, so I'm good. If he can have issues, I can have. So what we've seen is an implementation of how to test against an API, and I was going to show how you can use SpecFlow, right, to write these functional descriptions and map them against, steps of the implementations. And now it's even dead. Oh no, it's starting up. So the next thing I will show after this is Azure Load Testing. Do people familiar with that? So not too much. So with Azure Load Testing, what I would show is how you can set up tests quite quickly, again against my API, and how these tests can then be run with different virtual users. And the last part I want to show is, sorry again. So let's go back to the unit tests. And here are my functional tests. So if I click on, for example, the one that I have shown. No, let's go to the specs here. This is the one that I've shown. So this is just SpecFlow, a description, with the tooling. And I assume, because I'm not using Visual Studio, but I assume Visual Studio has similar plugins, I can just control-click and then navigate to the test implementation. If I say, I also have something like IntelliSense, so you can see here, the user reads the latest 10 activities. So as a tester, you could imagine that it's intuitive if you have a library of all these steps implemented. So in here, for example, I'm having that state. This is just a POCL, so plain old object, class object, I guess, I don't know. But that gets injected here, so I could use that. So I can say in step 1, test state user ID equals X, and I could say here, for example, test state user, I could read it. So that's how you can, from one step to the other, keep some track. For example, that's what I do here. Test state achievements that I read from the API here, get user achievements. This is, by the way, just calling my generated API client from NSWAG. That's how things work. So if I just execute here, run tests, then I'm not having my Docker running. So this will probably be having a timeout exception. But you can imagine that if my SQL starts up in time, that it becomes green. So I now got the test achievements and I verified these things by implementing that in SpecFlow. All right? So back to the presentation. And sorry for speeding up a bit, but I think it's the only way to at least show the things I have built. The other one is so Azure Load Tests. So Azure Load Test, you just generate as a resource in your resource group. It's quite straightforward. And what you can do, you have different tests. So I don't know if people are familiar with JMeter. I'm not, but it seems it's built on top of JMeter, which is like an open source tool for performance tests. The thing that I have used is really this. So you can generate a test, you give it a description. I typically have to enable the advanced settings because what you typically have is you want to do more specific items. You specify your test URL, how much users you have, and things like that. But I'll go back to a test that I have created already, because you have to realize also, if I start a new test, it typically takes time to spin up. So they have to spin up the instances, so it would take like 1 to 3 minutes before the test really starts. But this is a test that I have run earlier today. And what is nice there is that you actually have two side of metrics. So I specified, for example, that there's, I think, 2 agents. It runs for 20 minutes. And then you get the number of users at the same time. So I said 30 against my application. That's the response time, but I'm doing 5 different subsequent requests. So I'm simulating that I'm user X. That user is receiving his achievements and so on. So that's like a scenario that I use with APIs, and I can see what calls are typically there. And this is like the 90th percentile. So all the calls, or 90% of the calls, is faster than what you see. That's actually what is the 90%. So there again, it's important up front that you specify what you want to test and what you want to see as acceptance criteria. This is just a community application. Budget is limited. So this is more as demonstration purposes, but for other scenarios, this could be very important. So that's the client-side specifics. On the server-side metrics, I was able to say, and I think that's in the app components, I was able to say, okay, these and these and these components, so service bus, app service, my function, and things like that, or services that I know that will be hammered during this test. So you can add them, and you can also specify and see, oh, I had to scale out my functions. Oh, it seems that we have exceptions in this. So that's the whole thing. You can really monitor the utility and the usage of your backend systems that you have there. All right? Now, the last part, CD Kotako. So all of that was ready, of course, and I just had to go. I think this is in the source. So npx Cypress run. Let's hope I'm doing this right. So the UI testing, Lightroom Classic. Why not? The UI testing that we have, or that I use, is Cypress.io. It's also an open source tool. They have a cloud version where you can use their studio. It helps to automate your unit tests or your front-end tests against your deployed application. So you have Cypress Studio locally. And what I think is quite nice, you have also a test recorder. So you can just click in their studio, and it records the steps in your test case. And of course, you can easily see, okay, I have to clean up some things and so on, because it's sometimes not the best thing. But it's quite nice. So it looks like this, and I hope I can start it up. So I run my spec, and for every step that becomes green, I can also see what the state, how my screen looked like. So they are actually taking screenshots, and that could be quite nice. I haven't gone too far, to be honest, in their items, but I believe this could also be used for responsive testing. So you could say, I want to run it against a mobile device type of screen, so then my map should become different and so on. So that's something that you typically can run there. some expressions. So it's JavaScript based. So Sci is like the object of Cypress itself. So there I can say navigating to a page is sci.visit, and I go to climbs. So you can see this is a relative path because the base URL, again, is something that is in my configuration file, and it will depend on if I'm testing in dev, test, production, right? The base URLs should change, but the relative path not. Here, for example, I'm saying I want to click a specific button, and that's the tip I would give if you're a front-end person. It's quite easy if you, in your HTML elements, like in this button, if you give them an ID, because then you can reference directly with the ID. If you follow the tests, like the recording studio, they would look in the, what's it called, the DOM, so the document object model, and you would get like this string to get the specific button. And I think this is much easier, because if you change your layout, the ID should be the same. So that's a tip, because I had, then the protocol ID is a variable that I did a random thing. So if I click that one, I will, that happens. You can also check for existence of elements, like protocol DOM was an ID on an element that should not exist because I had a session where I was not logged in. So I cannot say that you did the climb or not. So that's a test where I say, okay, something like that. And what I also had to do, for example here, just making sure that I have 1,000, because there's 1,000 calls, that the table itself contained 1,000 items. Is it open? Oh no, sorry. Yes. So this is how it works, and then we can finish. So you have end-to-end testing and component testing. I always have used end-to-end testing. So again, I cannot emphasize or explain enough about this one. And behind the scenes, by the way, my application is not running. cd git, cd protocol. It could be that, I don't know against which API I'm now running, so it could be that my tests fail, but you should see the gist. So you can test multiple browsers, by the way. I clicked Edge, but if you have Chrome installed and Safari, you can also test them. And then you can see here you have these tests, and this is how they run. So they are green. For example, here you can see what I do. I clicked the climb. I then get protocol 148, so that's just a random number. So I get that element, and if I click that element, as you can see, it's red, so they have been clicking that. Then it should have navigated to the other one, where I say, oh, there should be an elevation and so on. So that's the replay of my recording. So what I can do exactly is say, oh, I want to do a new test. So let's give it, I think map is the right URL. Yes, voila. So you see, I'm now recording a test on the left, and everything I do, you know, I click on this, all of these things are being recorded. If I click save comments, I can say map test. And I don't know if it's somewhere open still. Yes. I think map test is here. So you can see these items have been automatically generated. But as I say, this is the ugly part. This is if I change my layout, my test would break. So that's where I say use an ID so that you can reference your elements by a specific ID instead of having the layout specific items. That's the important part. So that was quite quick because of the issues you've seen. As a last slide, what I say is, of course, that you typically stick it together. in your CI/CD. So I would say unit tests is the thing because they don't cost you any time to run typically. So I run them in every single phase and on every environment. But if I then do my CD, so my deployments, the unit tests and the integration tests and the UI tests, I run them against my environments that are not production, where I use the integration and the UI tests, of course, after my deployment has been done against my newly deployed environment. So it's like a post-validation. And in production, I would say the load tests, at least in the types of companies that I work with, are not automatically run. So because also Strava has rate limiting. So if I do a lot of load testing, I will be rate limited. So the load test is typically something you do on demand if you feel that it's needed, because resources are quite important for that. With that, I thank you for your patience, for coming to the best session on testing on IglooConf. And thank you.